As we reported last week, and in our continued study of the untold history of Mormonism, the Nauvoo saints, numbering upwards of 20,000, began to leave in the spring of 1846 under the direction of Brigham Young. In addition to battling with their Gentile neighbors over polygamy, stealing from the Gentiles, and the growing threat of Mormon military, the LDS leadership, including Brigham Young, Apostles Willard Richards, John Taylor, Parley P. Pratt, Orson Hyde, were involved in a counterfeiting scheme where coinage was called Nauvoo Bogus. This Nauvoo Bogus was authorized, created, and distributed by the Mormon leaders in Nauvoo. When U.S. Marshals reached Nauvoo in December of 1845 to arrest Brigham Young for his involvement in this scheme, he decided that the exodus west couldn't wait any longer. Hundreds of wagons filled with Mormon people began to move out. By December of 1846, very few Mormons were left in Nauvoo. This permitted the governor of Illinois, Thomas Ford, to say before a state legislature, quote, "It is with much satisfaction that I am enabled to say that the people called Mormon have been removed," end quote. I think in reporting this unheard history that the LDS leaving the state was both an unfortunate event in some ways, but a deserved one. I say this because Mormonism teaches even its children today that they were on the receiving end of all the persecution because of their righteousness. If, and this is an important thing to consider, if Mormonism was Christian and taught and lived the Christian life, it never would have been exiled from Illinois or any other place. There were Christian communities all over the United States, or at least the eastern United States at the time. America was founded on Christianity, for goodness sakes. Remember, Mormonism was driven out because they weren't Christian then. Nothing's changed now. They stand by their history, and they were not Christian then in deed or in doctrine. And they weren't driven out because they were Christian, okay? I was taught as a Latter-day Saint that the general reasons for the Mormon expulsion from Illinois was, one, that the Gentiles were jealous of their success and their growth, and two, that they were suffering for valiantly possessing the truth of God because they were good and the rest of the United States was evil. There may be some truth to some of the stuff regarding the Gentiles or the non-Mormons, but what the LDS do not admit today or teach, even to their adults, is there were plenty of things that they did to cause the people of this nation to, to fear and loathe them. First, they were religious elitists. They telling people, like they do today, that they alone possess all truth and no one else has all truth. To the Mormons, it was always their way or the highway. Now, sometimes the LDS will defend this, it's our way or the highway stance, by saying Jesus had that same stance. Jesus says, "I am the way, the truth," and if he can make that stance, there is nothing wrong with a church making that stance. I would suggest that Jesus did demand this, absolutely, but there is a great difference between saying he is the author and finisher of our faith and claiming a man-made religion is the only true church on the face of this earth and that everyone has to belong to it or they will not live with God. Secondly, what was the LDS way that they were claiming everyone needed to embrace back there at Nauvoo? What were the surrounding neighbors and people of Illinois hearing and seeing about the LDS that caused such fear and loathing? Think about this, okay? And use this in your discussions with the LDS when they start talking about how persecuted they've always been. First, they had a guy leading the church before he was killed who was dubious in his history at best, and he claimed to receive revelations from God and to be able to translate ancient papyri. They witnessed a town, Nauvoo, that had created their own set of laws. They witnessed a secret sect practice of polygamy where their own daughters were being taken in and being married at a very young age from their community. They saw a people who thought it was okay to steal from non-Mormons. They watched this group fight, retaliate, and parade a giant army as if going to war. They heard or saw firsthand Mormon retaliation in the form of Danite guys like Porter Rockwell. And they watched as this group grew in great numbers relative to most of the other towns in their states. Add to the fact that they spouted the idea that they were literally going to take over the world. How would you react? Do you think a group would frighten us today if it were here in the United States like that? Do you think this would arouse the attention of the federal government? I've used this example before, but I want you to just imagine in your community, somewhere in your state, in maybe a rural area, there is a town of 20,000 militant Islam fundamentalists that have gathered in the community, and they have been known to have taken lives. Okay? They have a singular leader who secretly practices polygamy with the women from your area. He has made his own laws. He has said things against the United States. And he's established his own military. He even rides around on a horse or now on a motorcycle dressed in full military regalia. Add in the fact that the followers of this man come into your town or community and they tell people all the time that they are going to take over the world. Would you fear this group? Would you try and get rid of them? Would you call in the National Guard? Well, this is how Nauvoo Mormonism was seen then. Listen, Americans have never appreciated people or groups that threaten two key things about our lifestyle. We don't like people who threaten our physical safety, and we don't like people or groups who threaten our property. In fact, our laws are sort of categorized into three sections: infractions, misdemeanors, and felonies, based off how much injury is caused to a person and how much property damage was caused to another person. I mention this in the hope of helping you LDS step down from your "we've been so persecuted" high horse and see your contributions to the troubles that you faced back there. Gordon B. Hinckley, before he passed away, was a master of getting the LDS to vicariously remember, even relive, a reconstructed and sanitized version of the LDS history, constantly honoring the forefathers who bore such hardships for the church. Today, Mormon youth actually dress, usually in the summer, in 19th century garb and drag hand carts across a portion of the hot desert in order to sort of relive this exodus west. I wish they would tell these good kids that it was what was leading Brigham to bring people out here and why they had to come here in the first place. After Brigham and his train left Nauvoo, they stopped in a place called Winter Quarters, which today is Omaha, Nebraska. And he and 142 others in April of 1847 left for the Great Salt Lake. Without question, this trip was arduous and difficult, but the Brigham Young party reached the Salt Lake Valley in July of the same year. Brigham Young had his dream: total seclusion, total allegiance of a people, and total control. Where Mormonism would have you believe that upon seeing the Salt Lake Valley, Brigham Young said, "This is the right place." I wonder if he looked and said, "Yeah, this is the right place." Many people like to suggest today that Brigham was a good man. The opinion is usually based on the indisputable fact that he was a hard worker, a clean liver, and that he knew how to lead people to productivity. But these same traits are shared by most bloody totalitarians. And I'm not angry, I'm just being real and painting you the picture that you never hear. This is the other side of the coin. In fact, I like to go on to record to state that Brigham Young, I've said it before, was in fact a very, very bad man. And one who would resort to almost anything to exercise control over everything he possibly could. Like most totalitarians, Brigham was not a man of small vision, and he quickly laid claim to a parcel of land that was absolutely enormous. Specifically, Brigham claimed all the land stretching from San Diego, California to present-day Denver, and from Wyoming to Arizona as theirs. Zion, as Brigham called it, included all of present-day Utah and Nevada, parts of Idaho, Oregon, Colorado, Wyoming, most of Arizona, a big part of California, and parts of New Mexico. According to the book Zion in Courts, Firmage and Mangrum suggest that this segment encompassed 1/6 of the United States, or about 265,000 square miles. Now remember, church and state were one single body in Zion, what Brigham called Zion. Courts were headed up by LDS authorities and functioned as church courts, who had the right to also inflict corporal punishment. This was in 1846. 3 years later, in 1849, however, a civil administration was put in place and formed what Brigham named the State of Deseret, which Young preferred over statehood to the Union. This model for Deseret is what Young hoped would last: theocracy, seeing himself as a benevolent dictator. I firmly believe that if Mormons today had the ability and opportunity, they would reinstitute and impose this theocratic model upon the state, upon the nation, and upon the world, if possible. Their history proves, and their doctrines and teachings prove, this is their ambition. Author David Bigler, who wrote Forgotten Kingdom, suggests, however, that this adopted civil administration was just a facade and was, quote, intended as a cover for the theocratic apparatus that truly governed the people. Bigler notes that when Deseret's General Assembly, which included a Senate and a House of Representatives, was put together, there were no elections held, just assignments given to the most prominent LDS men to fill these positions in the state and House. But Brigham Young was not so big that he could manipulate the U.S. government. In 1850, Utah became a United States territory under the power of Washington, D.C., and the Mormons out west, thank God, fell under this jurisdiction and control of Uncle Sam and his appointed territorial officers. The problem with this setup was, in a large way, geographical. Washington, D.C. was a long, long way from Salt Lake City, Utah in 1850, and Brigham Young knew it. So Brigham became Utah's first governor, which took the whole of the region back into his thick, calloused hands. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. In one sermon printed in the Deseret News in September of 1856, Brigham Young made it very clear what he thought about the United States and its watchful eye upon them when he said, quote, "As the Lord lives, we are bound to become a sovereign state in the Union or an independent nation by ourselves." This is really important to understand, my friends. When Jesus broke down all the walls, all the races, all the genders, nations, and people, and made the gospel available to everyone on the earth, with his church a body of regenerated believers, Brigham Young sought to resegregate what the Lord's wonderful desegregation, to establish a separatist master race, so to speak, on the ground of an imperial and autonomous nation that he called Deseret. This was theocratic totalitarianism. Obviously, the title of governor in this theocratic state was also a facade. Young wanted to control, to dictate everything, and he did. And if a person wanted to stay in the good graces of Young and his autocratic rule, they had better toe the line of obedience. Young told people how to worship, how to live, and, as Richard Abanus points out in his book, One Nation Under Gods, even what to wear. Said Young, quote, "The man whom God calls to dictate the affairs in the building of his Zion has the right to dictate about everything connected with the building up of Zion. Yes, even the ribbons the women wear, and any person who denies it is ignorant." Have you ever had to live or work or spend time with a truly, truly controlling person? I'm not sure if there's anything more demonic. Contrast the controlling individuality with a genuine Christian. In his sermon, Brigham Young used the word dictate twice. This was not a random choice of words for Brigham, for he thought himself as a dictator. Now, admittedly, the word dictator may have meant something very different back in those days, but the word did mean when I speak, you act. And this is how Brigham saw his relationship to people in this now isolated place. He spoke, they acted, or else. In a sermon in 1871, he stated, quote, I have been your dictator for 27 years, end quote. And Heber C. Kimball plainly described Young as, quote, our governor and dictator. Again, does this sound like Christianity? Does this sound like loving people filled with grace, trying to work with each other, learning? Yes, there are people who have to exercise control. But does this sound like Christianity in action? Now, keep the image of Brigham Young's Utah in your head and then ask yourself, what was going on in other parts of the world, just other parts of the United States, throughout the Christian world? Were there Christians then who were praising God, singing hymns, teaching the doctrine of grace, allowing people to live how they choose, teaching with love and the fruits of the Spirit, and salvation by Jesus and Jesus alone? Absolutely. But for some reason, Brigham Young thought that his ways of control and threats and violence and even murder, which we're going to talk about as the weeks go on, were superior to the ways of the biblical Jesus Christ. Brigham Young wouldn't even let the people own land. Instead, they were allowed to live on parcels meted out to them that were given to them by Brigham's church. Interestingly enough, the most beneficial lands were taken up by Brigham and other high-ranking officials like the creeks and the canyons. In addition to not owning their own land, church members were forced to consecrate and deed everything they owned over to the church trustee in trust. Guess who it was? Brigham Young. In the Journal of Discourses, Volume 2, page 298, Young justifies this consecration in this way. He says, since the world belonged to God and the saints were only acting as stewards of God's property, and the purpose of their stewardship was to build up the kingdom of God here on earth, which means Mormonism, always means Mormonism when they say that, which fell under the jurisdiction of Mormonism's head, Brigham Young, he had to have the ownership or the rights to all those things. Absolutely amazing. When we come back, we'll continue to talk about Brigham Young. We'll open up the phone line. See you in a second. Here's the real kicker about all of it. If a person apostatized or left the church, they lost, first of all, they were stranded in an isolated place that would take them a month by horseback to get out of. Secondly, they would lose their everything and were forced to abandon it to the church. So here the person was in the desert, owned nothing, and had to agree with everything that Brigham said. And if they chose to think for themselves, they were stripped of all they had, usually including their wife and their family. There was no choice. People were stuck. And we are going to talk in future weeks about how when some men tried to escape, Porter Rockwell and the Danites followed them out and killed them where they stood. So it's pretty much, in a way, the same situation today, my friends. How many emails do we read from people who say, I know the whole thing is a sham, but I can't leave it. My whole family is in it. My employer is LDS. I have nowhere to go. We read them often. I want you to know that you do have a place to go. And it's into the arms of the Lord, even if beginning by secret. You go to Him and you say, Lord, I know what I'm in is a sham. I need you to forgive me of my sin. I need you to take my life over. I want to be a Christian who leaves this world as a true believer in you, Lord. You show me the way how to get out of this deserted, isolated, autocratic place where everything in my life is controlled. And He will do it. We read the success stories all the time. And I want to tell you something. All the threats, the things you say in the temple, that if you do this, you're going to lose everything, and all the threats that you'll fall apart financially and you'll fall apart. I want to tell you something. Every single person I know who's left the church is still walking around happy, and especially if they left knowing the Lord, their lives are better. They praise God. It's a miraculous change to leave. You won't have this cloud hanging over your head like they threaten you with. I can promise you that, especially if you leave because you found bond, a relationship with Jesus Christ.